Welcome back. Today we are talking with W Hubbard, the author of The Failure of Risk Management. Doug, lots of great information in that first segment there. I mentioned in our break here, I'm going to be attending a risk assessment workshop tomorrow, and it's going to be interesting, I think. um, let's get back to some of the other questions that I had for you. You describe risk management with a long definition and a short definition. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, you know, I basically, for the long definition, I put together a comprehensive definition of risk and a comprehensive definition of management. And I said, let's just take these literally and put those two together. And that's what I did. And that's when I came up with the identification, analysis, and prioritization of risk, followed by a coordinated and economical application of resources to reduce the risk, et cetera. So that was the long one. The shorter one is just being smart about taking chances. You know, that's ultimately what all that means, being smart about those things, which, by the way, introduces the concept that in order to do risk management, we really have to go beyond risk management. It's really decision analysis. And I've written about this before, but risk management's part of decision analysis. When you make risk return trade-offs, who's computing the return? Risk managers are focusing primarily on bad things that could happen, mostly. But when you're investing in a big IT project, you've got risk and you've got some benefits, or some government policy or whatever it is. So some new R&D product or, pharmaceutical product, et cetera. There's going to be risk and there's going to be benefits. Now, the risk return analysis is really just the analysis of the entire decision. It's sort of like, I always thought that having risk management as a separate function in a firm is kind of like having a left-footed shoe store just for your left feet. Why would you do that? Why you wouldn't have a shoe store just for your left feet? You have both feet, so you're making decisions. Risk is one component in decisions, along with costs and benefits, things like this. So we should look at it from a holistic point of view, but I'm realistic. I understand that a lot of organizations already have the institution, they have the function of risk assessment. So I'm just taking it piecemeal. I'm saying, well, first, let's improve that. Let's get away from the methods that we know don't work. And there's plenty of research on that. It's all cited there in the book. Okay. Not my research, it's other people's research. I'm just citing them. And I looked at it from an objective point of view, I should say. I didn't set out to disprove risk matrices. It would have been great if I could find research that said, hey, it's measurably better than your unaided intuition. I would have written that. I wrote what I wrote because the research backed up that particular point. I had no skin in the game about I was out for risk matrices or not. No, that's a conclusion based on analysis and research. So anyway, that's what the long definition was all about, is putting together the definition of risk and the definition of management. And then the short definition was ultimately about being smart about taking chances, which really is kind of bleeding over into decision analysis as a broader concept. Decision analysis, game theory, portfolio optimization problems, things like that. That's the bigger picture part of things. It should all be part of the same solution.
Now, you mentioned project management, and in your book, you talk about the 4 risk management responses: avoid, reduce, transfer, and retain. And I quote, the boundaries around those are a little murky. Now, being in project management for many years, I had those 4 drilled into me, nonstop. Mm-hmm. So why do you say they're a little murky?
Well, first off, they're not mutually exclusive. So if I decide that I'm going to use an external vendor to develop some software for me, there might be 2 purposes for that. I might be transferring some risk, but I also might have reason to believe that because this is within their wheelhouse, they're better at it than we would be. So it's reducing risk and it's transferring some of that risk, and some of the risk is still being retained, right? So even if under the most generous and risk-averse kinds of agreements that you might ever be able to get a vendor to be able to sign, you're still retaining risk because you still have a lot of internal resources that you're applying to a given project. And if it doesn't work out, whatever benefits you were hoping to get, you might have to start from scratch. Or even if you didn't have to pay for the project, for the vendor's time, you still spent a lot of time yourself. And that whole time, competitors were working on their solutions and they get out the door earlier. So there's still risk that you're still retaining. So specific decisions, it's a risk return trade-off. So we often talk about return on control or return on mitigation kinds of problems. Here's how much this risk reduction is going to cost me. Here's how much that risk reduction is worth. Now, if I'm reducing risk by transferring part of it, well, I'm reducing it to me, right? I'm not necessarily reducing the universal risk. I'm just reducing it to me, which is the part I care about, right? For my firm, I'm getting someone else to take it. I can retain part of it. That's a risk return trade-off by itself. I reduce it. Those are all choices. I just don't think it's that important to make sharp distinctions. What matters is, I'm going to spend $1 million. Did I get $1 million worth of total risk reduction to me?
Does that mean you can never really reduce or remove any risk? That no matter what you do, risk is on some level is always going to be there?
Well, I mean, right up until we start predicting the future perfectly, yeah. And I don't see that happening soon. So yes, you're going to continue to make decisions under uncertainty. And that uncertainty means that some of the outcomes of decisions that we make, actions that we take or don't take, are negative. They're negative outcomes, things that if only we would have known better, we would have done something differently. That's always going to be the case. So what we can do, though, is be smart about how we're going to analyze those choices.
So I'm thinking back to my project management days when we had external vendors. You used a great example. And I remember vice presidents and project sponsors sitting there saying, yeah, we have a vendor, so we don't have any risk. Where does that mindset come from then? Is it a complete misunderstanding of what risk management is?
Well, they might not be wrong in thinking that they have less risk than if they did it themselves. That's probably, that could easily be true. Saying that they have no risk is kind of narrowing the scope of what risk they're looking at. So are they looking at, say, competitor risk? How do I insure against competitors coming out with a solution faster because my vendor didn't work out, even if I don't have to pay the vendor anything? How did I get out of that? If they think they've eliminated any risk, I think the only way to do that is just not be in business. So I don't know how I just don't see the avoid thing as a well-defined option really coming up. You're reducing risk, to yourself. You might be reducing risk overall, or even holding overall risk for all parties constant and giving it to somebody else, transferring part of it. But even that's a risk return trade-off, right? So when you transfer risk, for example, by buying insurance, that costs you something. How much risk did you really get for that insurance premium? How much risk reduction did you get for that insurance premium? By the way, these are some important concepts I talk about in the book, but if you're risk neutral, that's a well understood concept. To a risk neutral person, a 10% chance of winning $1 million is identical to having $100,000 cash. They would be indifferent between those two. That's a risk neutral person. From a truly risk neutral point of view, you would never buy insurance. It's because, obviously the insurance company has to make a margin. So from their point of view, the probability weighted average outcomes in terms of the claims they would have to pay out, has to be from their point of view, less than your premium. And assuming that you don't have necessarily more information than your insurance company would have, it's a net loss to get insurance every time, unless we quantify your risk tolerance, because losing 10 million is more than 10 times as painful as losing 1 million. And so there's a whole field behind that. It's utility theory. That's what expected utility theory is based on. And there's an important way to quantify your risk tolerance. So that I knew that was another thing we were going to talk about, but quantifying your risk tolerance is something that really needs to be done. There's a lot of interesting research on this, but your tolerance for risk is actually something that changes daily, subconsciously. You're not even aware that your tolerance has changed this day, but it could change for all sorts of irrelevant, random external factors that have nothing to do with the decision that you're making. You just feel, and you're not even aware that your risk tolerance has changed. You think it's the same as it was the day before. That's not true. But we can quantify your risk tolerance in a mathematically unambiguous way. This really comes from, I mentioned utility theory. You work out expected utilities and so forth. Again, it sounds like it's just theory. We do it all the time. Practical projects with clients, they use it. It's actually things like this are the basis for how we compute things like reserve risk for insurance companies or reserve risk for banks. Nuclear power does things like this. None of this had to be invented by us.
I like what you had to say there about risk tolerance, because with many organizations, they'll do a risk assessment, they'll determine their risk tolerance, and it'll stay that way for a year and a half, until they get around at some point, hopefully, to review their past results. Oh, did anything change? So how do you go about then, as you say, your tolerance changes every day, and sometimes you don't even know it's changing. How do you go about establishing that when you're trying to develop some sort of a mitigation plan against things, when the tolerance level is going all over the place?
Well, the point is to define it quantitatively well enough so it's not changing every day. Becomes a clearly defined policy statement that's written. Okay, it's in a calculation. And when we talk about a lot of organizations coming up with a risk appetite statement, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being able to make a choice like, can I tell from your risk tolerance statement that you prefer a 10% chance of winning $20 million over a 50% chance of winning $5 million? There's not a wrong answer there, by the way, but a mathematically explicit risk tolerance would answer that question. What would you consider a 10% chance of winning $10 million equal to? Most people would, if you had the choice between accepting $1 million cash or a 10% chance of winning 10 million, you would probably take the $1 million cash. I would think, if you're like most people, I would, right? On the other hand, suppose I reduce the certain monetary equivalent that I have over here. Suppose I said it's $500,000. What would you rather have, $500,000 or 10% chance of winning 10 million? Well, if you have a big portfolio and that's one of many, you would take the 10% chance of winning 10 million because, it kind of averages out. But if it's one of the few big choices you make, and you can always add zeros to those numbers to make it non-trivial for people, right? At some point, there's just barely equivalent value for you. Like you might say, I would be indifferent between $350,000 cash or a 10% chance of winning $10 million. That would be an expression of what your risk tolerance actually is. And a mathematically explicit expression of risk tolerance can answer questions like that. In fact, we reverse engineer things like utility functions, which are kind of abstract, but we reverse engineer them by asking people which bets they find acceptable. Which bets do they prefer to other bets? We only ask them for 3 or 4 such bets, and then we can figure out their function. And then based on that, we can figure out if you are internally consistent, I can determine how you should choose among a series of other bets.
How does impact come into this? Because there's risk tolerance and organizations and leadership who think about, the avoid, transfer, mitigate, etc. What about the impact? Does that get calculated in somehow? And if so, how?
Well, yeah. So obviously impact is not a medium or critical or a 4 on a scale of 1 to 5 to us. It's a range. Okay. It's usually a monetized range. Even when it includes things like human health and safety or things like electrical reliability and so forth, we still monetize all the risk. People routinely monetize the value of human life, by the way. That happens quite a lot. And lots of every government agency that has some responsibility for, human health and safety uses the VSL, the value of a statistical life, in their calculations. So people might be surprised by that. Sometimes I tell clients that, we can monetize things that way. There's some initial resistance. And I always say this, and I have this discussion about including things like the value of human health and safety, or in saving endangered species, or the intellectual development of children, which, by the way, you can have. There's pollutants like methylmercury and pollutants from coal burning plants that might actually affect poorer communities around the area in terms of the intellectual development of children at a very young age. It's possible. It's not certain, but it's possible. And it's a risk that you want to include. So what's that worth? What's a couple of IQ points worth for a population of young kids? How about 5 IQ points? And would you rather spend $50 million to fix that, or $50 million to reduce the number of accidents on a big interchange? And do we necessarily equate people dying of different ages all the same? There's methods for dealing with that. And I never tell people that I'm trying to convince them to use a monetary value for human life. I just point out you've always been doing it. I just say, no, you've been doing it this whole time. You don't have to listen to me arguing for it. I'm just saying, I'm telling you to be consistent about it. You've been doing it every time you've made choices, and you've made choices in your personal life about how much risk of death you're willing to accept to save money. You could have spent more money on a car with a higher safety rating. Do you have a Tesla?
Me, no, not yet.
I don't either. But apparently, for what I know so far, the last time I heard, they had the highest safety rating because they're on this big solid block of batteries, on a big their skateboard kind of thing. So it does really well on head-on collision tests and stuff like this. So why didn't I get one of those if I really cared about the value of my own life? Well, time and money. I charging that thing is a lot slower than just filling a tank of gas, and it costs more, et cetera. There's trade-offs. You and I could both go out and get a whole series of medical tests right now, even things that aren't covered by our insurance, because there is a chance that you could find some condition that you found just in time to save your life. You don't know that you wouldn't find that. Whatever, however diminishingly small that chance is, that exists right now, unless you've already done all those tests. There's a chance right now that you would find something like that. I didn't do it. You're probably not going to do it this year. There's only so much money we're willing to spend, time and money we're willing to spend, even to reduce our own risk of death. So that information is used in a whole series of, surveys and how people spend their time and money versus, mortal risk reduction kinds of investments that they can make, having a house closer to where you work so you don't commute as far, which slightly reduces your chance of death, right? Or having a 4th smoke detector in your home. Replacing tires twice as often on your car. Just marginal reduction, chance of death. There's only a point up to which you would do that, just like everybody else. So, but here's the problem. When we do that inconsistently, we're doing it suboptimally. In other words, unless you're actually putting a value on a human life, you're undervaluing a human life. You're making safety worse unless we're doing the math. That we can show. If you're trying to optimize any portfolio with inconsistent objectives, you're going to suboptimize those objectives. And that includes the value of human life. So if we care about human life, we should monetize it.
That seems so opposite of what we hear. It really does.
Yeah, I know.
But it makes logical sense.
It makes sense. And I know that, that's the thing about facts. We don't have to agree with them. We don't have to feel better about them. That nature and the universe doesn't care about our feelings or anything like that. So facts are facts. The fact is that we can show mathematically, if you have inconsistent objectives, you're going to suboptimize a portfolio based on those objectives, whatever they are. And we know that people already behave as if they have a limited value for a human life. But they don't really behave as if it's infinite.
Interesting.
If they did, they'd behave very differently.
Yeah. We only have, believe it or not, 4 minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts on risk management, and potentially what can risk managers or corporate leaders start doing differently right away? How can they start making a change?
Well, here's the first thing I would tell people. All of the books that I've written so far all have, as I mentioned, have their own websites. You can go to www.howtomeasureanything.com and you can see the risk management book there. The first file you can see to download is called the 1-for-1 substitution. So that risk matrix meeting you have coming up, if you had the authority to do so, I don't know if you did or not, but you could just replace the entire risk matrix population meeting with the 1-for-1 substitution model. It's just as simple. You're still putting a probability and an impact on it, except you're doing it explicitly quantitatively. And then you can actually compute things. It actually includes a Monte Carlo simulation right in the Excel spreadsheet. You can compute things like, here's my loss succeedance curve that shows the probability of losing more than different amounts of money in a given period of time. So it's very useful that way. And it gives you the most rudimentary method, very simple method for computing a return on control. So a risk matrix doesn't do that. And then if you wanted to go even further, well, now you have a good foundation for adding more things. You can say, hey, how are these things correlated? Well, I know how to do that if you're talking about quantitative methods. I don't know how to correlate dots on a risk matrix, but I know how to correlate those rows on the risk register that the one-for-one substitution is. So there's instructions right there. Make that change right away. The other things you could do is, first off, get calibrated. So calibrate your subject matter experts. We know how to train people to better subjectively assess probabilities. That's a baseline for a lot of the analysis that we do. And then if we went a little bit further, we could start to adopt some statistical methods that improve further our initial subjective estimates. So we don't have to rely entirely on subjective estimates. In fact, a lot of the risks that you're currently analyzing are risks that have probably been measured. They've been measured before. We don't have to invent anything new there. You probably have more data than you think. You need less data than you think. You need different data than you think, and it's probably been measured before. I say that in all my books. So that's where to get started. Just if you've got a risk matrix meeting later this week, just repurpose it. Just make it a one-for-one substitution meeting. Every dot, I call it a one-for-one substitution because every dot on the risk matrix is a row on this new table I'm giving you. So just download that and do that instead.
Well, it's definitely going to be an interesting meeting for me at my risk meeting, assessment meeting tomorrow. I'll definitely be thinking things and bringing different ideas forward. So thank you very much, Doug. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, you bet. And by the way, that book is full of all the reasons not to use the risk matrix, including lots of citations for other research that other people did, not me. So yeah, thanks for your time.
Yeah, that's one reason why I wanted to talk to you, because as soon as I read the piece about the risk matrices, I had it so ingrained in my head. I went, I've got to talk to Doug about this because it's literally stamped on my head every single day to use this in our industry. So thank you very much. I really appreciate everything you had to say. We were talking with Doug Hubbard today and his book, The Failure of Risk Management. Check it out. It will make some changes in your organization, I hope. Thanks, Doug, and everybody watching and listening. Stay prepared, everybody.
Thanks.
If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.